Okay, for those that are here, thank you for bearing with some technical difficulties, which we are still in the midst of. So we don't have the normal projection on the screen, but hopefully you're able to see. And for those who are joining us by live stream, I don't know that this is going to be coming through to you. If you are watching on live stream, you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint slides, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to send them to you. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulty this morning that we'll work our way through. So, where were we? Because I think the last time we were together, I was here before you talking about Revelation chapter 12 before COVID rudely interrupted us. As Donnie said, we're thankful that many of us who were a part of that have been able to come out of it, and certainly pray to God that that will be the end of it. But I want to spend a little bit of time, since a few things have happened since we last got together, to talk a little bit about the background of Revelation chapter 12 and what we talked about, just to remind you and set the stage for what we're going to talk about in Revelation 13. So if you can advance the slide, Brent. One of the things about what we're dealing with is I'm going to have to do this. Some of this may be hard to read, but hopefully you'll follow along. So we talked about in chapter 12 that there was a great red dragon, and we talked about the fact that the Bible actually in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9 describes that as being Satan, the devil. And he's described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. And so that's something that's going to come up as we get into chapter 13 as well. It's going to be something that we see in chapter 17 of Revelation, which we'll talk a little bit about this morning as well. And we read about the fact that the dragon was trying to kill a man-child from its birth, that it was there waiting to try to do that. And we talked about the description of that man-child, that he was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And we looked at scriptures in the Old Testament that's prophesied about Christ and about how he would be a ruler who would rule over all the nations. And it was described as being a government that would rule with a rod of iron. And it says that he was caught up into God. So we talked about the fact that man-child depicts Christ and the role that he would play in the story. We also read about how the dragon was seeking to destroy a woman who wore a crown of 12 stars. And we talked about how that woman fled to the wilderness, where she would be protected there in the wilderness for a space of 1,260 days. We've seen how in the book this same period of time is referred to. Sometimes it's referred to as 1,260 days. Sometimes we'll see in Revelation chapter 13 it's described as 42 months. Sometimes we see it described as 3.5 years, and it's done that way in reference to a time and times and half a time. So we've seen that same period of time. We talked about the fact that that period of time refers to times where the church was going to be persecuted, but it would be protected of God during that time, and that the fact that it was 3.5 years was a broken 7, a half of a 7, which indicated that it was 7 meaning completion or perfection, that it would be a temporary space of time that they would be persecuted. But we talked about how this woman was depictive of God's people, the church. Next slide, Brent. So then we talked about the fact that war ensued. You'll remember it's depicted that Michael and the angels did war with the dragon, and the dragon's defeated. And we talked about how he was defeated. He was defeated, we're told, by the blood of the Lamb, by Christ's redeeming blood, by the word of their testimony, the fact that they were willing to confess Christ to others, and that they loved their lives not unto the death, meaning they were willing to endure persecution. They were willing to hold fast this confession of Christ, even if it meant the loss of their lives. And then we read in Revelation 12 and verse 17, where we'll pick up now in the story, that the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So that sets us up well for talking about Revelation 13 and verse 1, which we'll begin with. Next slide. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of Blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So we are introduced to this character, this sea beast that's referred to here in Revelation 13 and verse 1. And what I want to do is that, and we've alluded to this, we've talked about the fact that a proper understanding of the book, at least in the view of me and Brent, in our view of this, is that there are a lot of Old Testament passages that bear a lot of resemblance to the things that we read about in the book of Revelation, that it's important to understand those Old Testament passages as we read it. And one of the books in particular that we've talked about over the course of this is the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel includes some very strikingly similar things to what we read about here in Revelation 13. So I want to turn back to Daniel chapter 7 and read there from Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 2. And we're going to be referring a lot to Daniel, so if you find it, you might want to keep your finger there, and along with Revelation 13, because we'll be bouncing back and forth a little bit. In verse 2, it says, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night. Actually, you can go to the next slide, Brent. Sorry about that. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens drove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. If you'll skip down to verse 17, then it says, These great beasts which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. So here we have a description seemingly very similar to what was described elsewhere in elsewhere in the book of Revelation, that there is coming out of the sea four great beasts, diverse one another. And we're told in verse 17 that these great beasts are kings. And you'll see elsewhere in the book of, or in the chapter of Daniel 7, that he refers to these as kingdoms, four kingdoms. And if you study the book of Daniel, if you can go to the next slide, Brent, you'll know that the book of Daniel is replete with references to four kingdoms that would rule in the earth. You will recall in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, saw an image. He had this dream, and he saw this great image that came before him, and it had a head of gold. It had the breasts and arms of silver, and a belly and thighs of brass, and legs of iron, feet part of iron, part of clay. And this has been talked about before, but just to review a little bit, Daniel goes on to interpret this dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2 and verses 37 and 38, he says, You are that head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, which you read about in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1, that he is referred to as the king of Babylon. He says, You're that head of gold. So Babylon was depicted. It was the world power of that time. They were the ones who had actually taken the Jewish people into enslavement or into captivity. And he says, You're the head of gold. And he says, There's going to be another king that rises up after you, another kingdom. And he says, That's the breast and the arms of silver. And we read about through the course of the book of Daniel. You can look in Daniel chapter 5, in verse 28 and 31. There it says, in a different part, Nebuchadnezzar has gone on. He's replaced as king by Belshazzar. And there's another writing that comes up on the wall. And on that, he's told that his kingdom is finished in verse 26, that he's weighed in the balance and found wanting in verse 27, and then in verse 28 it says, Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So this Medo-Persian Empire, history records, is actually the next great kingdom that comes into play. So after this head of gold comes this breast of arms and silver in the form of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then there's this belly and thighs of brass, and in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 39, it said that this would be a kingdom that would rule over all of the earth. And history records, of course, that the next great world empire that came into place was the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great, that came and did have a very significant extent beyond those that had come before it, Babylon or Medo-Persia, a very extensive kingdom that was over it. And we read about actually specifically in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 21, there it says in a different prophecy, but still talking about these same kingdoms, it says Brent's given a whole lesson on this, so I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there's a rough goat that is depicted in the stairs, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, which follows the ram. If you look in verse 20, that refers to Media and Persia. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So if you know anything about the history of the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great was the great, powerful leader of that nation, but it really broke up into four different divisions of four different generals that came to rule different areas of the world. And so this very specifically speaks about that breakup of the empire that Alexander the Great first created. And then we read about the legs of iron, feet part of iron and part of clay, referring to the fourth kingdom. And the Bible tells us in Daniel chapter 2 and verses 40 through 44, it says, In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And I know we've talked about this when we go through the book of Daniel chapter 2, but you can go and find, when you look at the life of Jesus, when they came to be taxed, that it talks about Caesar Augustus being the ruler in that particular time. So in the days of the Roman emperors, God set up a kingdom in Acts chapter 2, as we read about in the day of Pentecost. And it was during the time of Rome that these things came to pass. You can read more about these things in Daniel chapter 7. We're going to look at some of those things this morning, also in Daniel chapter 8, because it consistently talks about, in various prophecies, these four world kingdoms that would come to pass that are prophesied about by Daniel. Okay, I want to look, next slide, at some comparisons to the fourth kingdom that Daniel describes and what we read about here in this sea beast that's depicted in Revelation chapter 13. One of the things we see is that, as we've talked about already, the fourth kingdom of Daniel, like the rest of the kingdoms, the four kingdoms, they came from the sea, Daniel describes. And we see here John in the Revelation describing that this sea beast came forth from the sea. And then we read that he was preceded by a lion, a bear, and a leopard. So if you can look in Daniel chapter 7, and we'll read that there in chapter 4, it says, these four beasts that we read about that came up from the sea, it says, the first was like a lion, verse 4, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had three ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. And this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast had also four heads, and dominion was given to it. And this I saw in the night visions, and beheld a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So we'll talk about that last part as it relates to the fourth kingdom, but I just want to note that the first three kingdoms are described here by Daniel as being in order a lion, a bear, and a leopard. So as Daniel looked forward in time to these kingdoms that were not yet to be, he describes Babylon as being like a lion, he describes Medo-Persia as being like a bear, and he describes the Grecian Empire as being like a leopard. And there's much we could say to talk about that. I'll note particularly as it refers here to this leopard here that it says it also had four heads. So it's again referencing that division of the Grecian Empire that would take place. When John looked back in time, he described this sea beast as being like a leopard, a bear, and a lion. So reverse order as he looks back in time, but very similar description here being given. We read about the fact that in Daniel chapter 7, it says that in verse 12 here, it says, concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season in time. And there were aspects of the power of Babylon and Medo-Persia and Greece that Rome had a part of within it. And that's reflected here. We read in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7, as we read about this fourth beast, that it was strong exceedingly. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 7. And then we read in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 7 that it's described as having great power. And then if you will look in Daniel chapter 7, verse 20, it refers to the fact that this fourth beast, it says, and of the 10 horns that were in its head, and of the other which came up, and before whom three fell, even of the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. And if you look over in Revelation 13 and verse 5, we read about the fact that this beast that is described there, the sea beast in Revelation chapter 13 and 5, it is said there, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. We'll come to that more specifically in a little bit. But they spoke great things, both of them. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, it refers to the fact that this king that was described here, it says, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of times. So he was to wear out the saints of the Most High. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 7, we read about the sea beast. It was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. So both are described as being at war with the saints of God. And then next slide, if we can look at one last comparison of this fourth kingdom Daniel and the sea beast, that it is said in, as we just read in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, that their persecution would continue for a time and times and the dividing of time. And then we see that very same time period depicted in Revelation 12 and verse 14, as we talked about there in Revelation chapter 12, but also in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5, this 40 and 2 months that we read about there. So the same space of time that is depicted here. Why am I saying all this? I'm saying it to say that the kingdom that Daniel described as this fourth kingdom is the very same kingdom that we're talking about here in Revelation chapter 13. It is a reference to the same kingdom, that kingdom of Rome, which was the ruling empire at that time. So let's go to the next slide if we can, please. Revelation chapter 17, we've been kind of teasing this a little bit, is a part of the book that kind of where the account sort of steps outside of the descriptions of the imagery and so forth that was given, and gives a little bit of the key to some of the imagery that exists in the story and tells you what it is that it depicts. But read about in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1, and there it says, "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters." Now, it's a little bit uncomfortable. Brent and I had a little bit of a tussle about this, I guess, not really, but I'm getting a little bit ahead by going into some of what Revelation 17 has to say, but I think it's important for us to do, and I'm not going to get into all of it, but he gives this description of a great whore that sits on many waters, and in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, it says, "So he carried me away in the spirit in the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." So the same kind of thing we've been talking about. The great dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns. This sea beast we read has 7 heads and 10 horns. And now we see this scarlet-colored beast upon which this woman who's described as a whore or harlot is sitting upon. What is all this about? Well, first of all, I want to take note that in verse 15 it says, in the midst of, I guess this begins in verse 7, where it says, "The angel said to me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns." So that gives you the indication we're going to be given a little bit of clue about what this is all about. But I want to notice in verse 15 it says, "And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues." So when we hear about this beast coming forth out of the sea, and we see these kingdoms being described as coming out of the sea, we're talking about the peoples of the world, the nations of the world. They came up out of those, and in fact that is descriptive of all of these kingdoms. They came forth out of the world, of these nations of the world whom they ruled over. So I want to turn to Revelation before we get more into chapter 17. I want to turn back to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3. Next slide if we can. I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So we have a beast. It's described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. And here we have a fact given to us that one of his heads, as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So what is that about? What are these heads that we're talking about? So let's turn to Revelation chapter 17, begin reading in verse 7, and we'll get the code breaker, if you will, here in Revelation 17. "And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are great kings. 10 kings, which receive no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he saith unto me, The waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdoms unto the beast, unto the words of God, until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So let's talk about a little bit of this. We're not going to talk about all of it, but I want to pick up a few pieces of what we read about here in Revelation chapter 17. So the first thing I want to pick up is that it talks about a city on 7 hills reigning over the kings of the earth. We pick up the 7 cities, 7 hills, in verse 9, where it says, "And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth." Now, Rome is a city that is set on 7 hills, famously so. In fact, there are coins that were circulating around this time that had an image of the goddess Roma, who is depicted as sitting on these 7 hills. It is said by some, and I know you probably can't read this, but Kenneth Gentry wrote, "Perhaps no point is more obvious in Revelation than this one. Rome is the one city in history that has been distinguished for and universally recognized for its 7 hills." Suetonius and Plutarch record for us that in the time of Domitian, the festival of Septimontium, the feast of the 7-hilled city, was held annually in December to celebrate the 7 hills enclosing Rome. And then Robert Mounce went on to say, "There is little doubt that a first-century reader would understand this reference in any way other than as a reference to Rome, the city built upon 7 hills." So a lot of things we're talking about, you can go and you can Google them up and look at it. You'll see if you put on a city on 7 hills, Wikipedia will take you to descriptions of Rome being a city that is on 7 hills. So as we see this description being given here in verse 9, we have a reference to the 7 heads being 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. And it goes on to talk about there are 7 kings. We'll get to that in just a second. We read about in verse 18 that the woman which he saw was the great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Again, unmistakably, Rome was the city that ruled over the kings of the earth in that particular time. It was the dominant world power. So I want to turn now to Daniel chapter 7 and read some of Daniel's account there. And then we'll have some comments to make about how that matches up with what we read about in Revelation. So we'll begin in Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 7 and 8. It says, "And after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly, and had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things." If you'll turn down then to verse 19, it says, "Then I," Daniel speaking, "said, would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be the 4th kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. And another shall arise after them. He shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times in the dividing of time. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom over the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Hitherto is the end of the matter, and as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart." So here we have Daniel describing this 4th beast. And what Daniel says about this 4th beast is that these 10 horns that are depicted here, he says out of this kingdom are 10 kings. And yet he describes an 11th that shall rise after them, who shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings, and shall speak great words against the Most High, and wear out the saints of the Most High. So let's look a little bit in the next slide at the history of some of the Roman emperors that existed. So we mentioned the first of these, Augustus Caesar. That was the Caesar that reigned. It was the first Caesar. You've heard the name Julius Caesar, but if you look up at the emperors of Rome, Julius Caesar was not that. In fact, the name Caesar was taken from him to depict that situation of being the emperor, the leader, and that was done in the first instance of Augustus Caesar, who reigned from 31 BC to 14 AD. So he's the first Roman emperor. After him followed Tiberius Caesar, who reigned from 14 to 37 AD. Caligula, some of these names you may have heard before, 37 to 41 AD. Claudius Caesar from 41 to 54 AD. and then Nero Caesar, surely you've heard of, 54 to 68 AD. Now, after Nero died, there were three kings that followed him. In fact, the period of time in which they reigned is called the year of the four emperors, because they reigned for such a short period of time that they sort of spanned over that period of time. Galba reigned for 7 months, spanning over part of 68 to 69 AD. Otho ruled 95 days in 69 AD, and Vitellius ruled 8 months in 69 AD. So those are three kings that appear in rapid succession, much shorter reigns than what you can see in some of these others. And then came Vespasian Caesar that reigned from 69 to 79 AD, followed by Titus, his son, who reigned from 79 to 81 AD, and then Domitian Caesar, 81 to 96 AD. So let's overlay this with what Daniel foretold as we think about the fact that he was depicting the Roman Empire, and he talks about these 10 kings and then 11 that follow, and we have them described here. He mentions there were 3 kings that were uprooted that were taken up. That appears to refer to these 3 kings that were for just a very short period of time, and we'll look at some of the reasons why we come to that conclusion when we come to Revelation of what it says. And then we have Domitian as this 11 that appears to be this little horn that's referred to here as we look at just, really just the history of what was the succession of the emperors that existed there. So let's turn back to Revelation chapter 17. Look at the next slide. The Roman emperors that Revelation describes. So in Revelation chapter 17, we have an account of 7 kings in verse 10. There were 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and one is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th and is of the 7 and goeth into perdition. So here, John describes a total of 8 kings that existed. So we have 11 in Daniel, we have 8 here that John describes. He says 5 are fallen. So as we think about just purely the order of these kings and how they came about, that would refer to the Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero period of time. Those 5 are fallen. In other words, the time has passed. Their rule is gone. Now, John appears to have ignored the 3 that were uprooted, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius in this, who reigned for a very short period of time. And he says there's one that is, which would refer to Vespasian Caesar, one that has not yet come, but must continue a short space. Titus reigned for just a couple of years, 26 months in total. And then there's a reference to the beast that was and is not and yet is. So I want to talk about what we can make of that. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 8 describes the beast thou sawest was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. So as we look at history, next slide, of what occurred, Nero, history records, was a very brutal persecutor of the church. And I would suggest to you that when we think about the beast that was, when we think about this persecuting civil authority in Rome, that Nero was involved in persecution, the beast that was. And then as we look at the ones that followed him during the reigns of these 3 short kings, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, but also during Vespasian and Titus, history doesn't really record that there was much of a persecution of the church that was going on during the reigns of these kings. So there was a period of respite from the persecution that took place. So you can see how this fits in with the idea that there was a beast in the form of the persecuting Roman Empire under the reign of Nero, and then the beast that was not, that went away because there was this period of respite from the persecution. And then it says it yet is, because history records that Domitian resumed Nero's persecution of the church. If you look in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3, back where we're reading, it says, and I saw one of his heads, because I'm going to try to piece all this together. I saw one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. So now we can kind of put some of these pieces together, I think, that Nero his persecution seemed to have come to an end. It seemed as this head was wounded to death, but the deadly wound was healed in the form of the return of that persecution that took place during the time of Domitian. It's recorded, and we don't have the original of this next slide, Brent. This is going to be hard for y'all to read, so I'll just kind of take you through this. There we go. It's recorded by Eusebius, who wrote a church history in 325 AD, some of the details of Domitian's reign. And he quoted from some others who wrote at earlier moments in time. There was Melito, a bishop of the church in Sardis, who wrote an apology to Marcus Aurelius, who was then the Caesar on that occasion in AD 175. Nero and Domitian alone, stimulated by certain malicious persons, showed a disposition to slander our faith. Eusebius went on to write that Domitian is the second that raised a persecution against us. Eusebius also quoted from Tertullian, who spoke of Nero as the first emperor who dyed his sword in Christian blood when our religion was just but arising at Rome. He called Domitian a limb of the bloody Nero and wrote that Domitian finally showed himself the successor to Nero's campaign of hostility toward God. He was the second to promote persecution against us. So we have record of history that Nero was a persecutor of the church, that persecution seemed to go away. We certainly don't have any record of that persecution happening, but then we have record of the second to come along and to promote this was Domitian, which supports the idea that there was this bit of respite that took place from it. Now, I would tell you there's some modern scholars that have called into question just how much evidence there may be of Domitian actually being a persecutor of Christians, and they look at some of the civil historians at the time and say they don't say much about it, so they kind of look at this absence of evidence of any great persecution and call into question that. But the affirmative evidence we have of history that records it is that Domitian was a persecutor of Christians, which fits in with the description that we have in the account of the book of Revelation of the fact that this persecution would come back into place as we look at these kings. So, turning back to Revelation chapter 13 and verse 4, Revelation 13 and verse 4, it says, "And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" So this beast that we have described here, it talks about how, if we can go to the next slide, Brent, that this beast is described as having received its power from Satan. So we know that Rome was in fact being used as an instrument of Satan in this war, and it says that they worshiped the dragon. I don't know this necessarily means that they per se worshiped Satan in the way that we often think about it, Satanism, but in worshiping of the beast, they were in fact worshiping Satan, and they said, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And we find in the records of history that in the Roman Empire, it was a common practice to require emperor worship. There are coins that bear record of the idea that the Caesars consider themselves to be gods. There are, in fact, records of certificates that one had to get. This gets into a little bit of what comes in the last part of Revelation 13, which I've decided is too much to cover. So we're just going to get through verse 10, and we'll get through the last part of this really quickly because most of the heavy lifting is over now, so rest easy. But certificates of people who there was record given of them that they had done that worship of the Caesar, of the emperor. That was part of something that was required at that time to be able to say that you had done so, and you were excluded from trading and other things if you didn't have that. So in verse 5 then it says, "There was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months." So we've talked about this. It's the same space of time that we've been talking about through the book of Revelation, a temporary space of time that was given unto this beast to speak these great things and blasphemies that were said. Going down into verse 6 through 8. "And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. It was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world." So this beast is described as being one that would speak blasphemy, and it would be a blasphemy that would not only be against God, but would be against his people, the tabernacle of God. We've talked about in various places in our study, also those that dwell in heaven, having reference to the church as being the temple of God. And so there would be blasphemies that would be spoken against these people. And this beast would be worshipped, but not by everyone, right? There are people who are going to be faithful to God, but it would be worshipped by those who are not written in the book of life of the Lamb that we read about elsewhere in the book as well. So there would be people of the world that would worship this beast. Again, we'll get into some more of that worship as we get into the latter part of Revelation 13. Verses 9 and 10, it says, if any man have an ear, let him hear. Next slide. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. We're on the last slide. I told you we'd get through the last part rather quickly compared to the rest of it. Okay, so here we have a nice place, I think, to stop and reflect on that what he's saying here is that if you have an ear, hear what I have to say. We've heard that expression before in Revelation 2 when he's given the message to the churches in Asia that we read about. But he says, he who leads into captivity shall go into captivity, and he that kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. In other words, there's a comeuppance that's going to come to those who are doing these things, those who would put people into captivity, those who would kill with the sword. They're going to face that same fate. And again, that's consistent with what we've been talking about throughout as we read about these warnings of judgments, of these 7 trumpets we've talked about, and we will get into in the next few chapters talking about the vials of God's wrath that are poured out. We're going to see this played out, but again, the message, and again, this is central to what I believe the book is talking about, as it talks about things which must shortly come to pass. Again, the message being to the Christians, hold tight, hang in there, you're going to be persecuted, but you need to be faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life, Revelation 2 and verse 10. He's telling them to be, here's the patience and faith of the saints. You need to be patient. In other words, we think about patient being, I'm going to wait in the traffic for a little bit. I was talking with my kids a little bit about this, about an incident that happened here in Houston recently. It's a good idea to be patient while you're driving. There's a lot of crazy people out there. But we're not talking about patience really in that sense. We're talking about an ability to endure in the face of temptation. So the saints were being called upon to have that endurance in the face of tribulation and trial that they were going through, and to be faithful through the midst of this. And that's the message, I think, of the book of Revelation in its entirety, but particularly the message that we leave here as we look at verses 9 and 10. When we get into the rest of chapter 13, we'll get into a different beast that's depicted here, but very similar, and we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next time we get together and do this. So I appreciate your attention very much. I hope that was helpful. I know the slides were a little bit difficult to read, so again, whether you're on the live stream or whether you're here, if you'd like a copy of those, let me know, and that goes for really any of the slides we put together on any of this. Happy to provide those to you. The message, I hope, is one of encouragement to us, because we don't face the same kind of things they did in that time, but I hope it's encouraging us to know that we serve the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, and that we serve a God who in the end is going to be victorious, and that we're going to have victory in the way that we read about in Revelation chapter 12, and talks about by the blood of the Lamb. We are victorious because Jesus died and shed his blood so that we could be forgiven of our sins. And that's the same victory we can enjoy today. And if you haven't had a part of that victory, we want to encourage you to take part of that and be obedient to him in baptism. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, you're willing to confess him before men, and you're willing to repent of your sins and to be buried with him in baptism, we can enjoy that same forgiveness of sins. So if we can help anyone in that, please let us know. Come forward. And if there's anyone we can help with prayers to the church, we'd be happy to do that as well. If you'll come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.